Hello, everyone. I'm North Hempstead Town Supervisor Judy Bosworth. The town board and I are proud to present a very special At Home with North Hempstead program, celebrating the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. The role he played in the American Civil Rights Movement would forever change the face of history and alter the direction of this country. It's extraordinarily important that we follow the path that Dr. King paved for us. We must all find the courage to stand up and fight for human equality, dignity, and justice for all. While so much has been done, there is still much work left to do.
Hi, I'm Rabbi Davidson from Great Neck, New York. Well, so they were basically the Steamboat Road area and the Spinney Hill area, which was off of Northern Boulevard, going down the hill toward Manhasset, and a little bit south of that. Black areas that were communities. They each had their own church. In Spinney Hill, it was the Mount Olive Baptist Church, which I'll come to in a later context, and the AME Zion Church. And they had very fine ministers, and they were communities unto themselves. They didn't socialize or get involved business-wise in most of what was going on in Great Neck until a bit later on, but ultimately that changed. So that was one part of this sort of separation. Another part was that when I first came here, it was very difficult for a black family to move into other parts of Great Neck. Very, very difficult, even if they could afford it. I remember the stories were told, and I was not intimately involved in it, but that Ralph Bunche, who was the General Secretary of the UN, was trying to get a home in Great Neck. Why? Because the UN was in Great Neck. It was at Lake Success. And he evidently could not. That's what I think that probably happened even before I came in the late 50s. But I do very well remember that the Committee on Human Rights in Great Neck, which was a significant group of liberal, visionary folks in the town, including some of the people that we've talked about, such as May Newberger and others, were trying to desegregate the apartments, and did what was being done in other communities too. Check out whether there's a vacancy, have a white person do that, and substantiate that there was, and then send the African American family over there to apply for the apartment, and create enough of a fuss that after a while that did seem to work, though it was resented by a portion of the community. But the Committee on Human Rights tried to do that, and did it, fearlessly and regularly, and ultimately there was some movement in that regard. But there was that kind of self-imposed segregation just because of the nature of the economy. Well, there were lots of things that were occurring. I was an active member of the Committee on Human Rights, and so housing was an important issue, and I was certainly involved in that. And I spoke a lot about it, and of course I was anxious to communicate with young people in our congregation and in the community of the importance of integration, the importance of accepting people of other races and religions, and often was asked to speak at the high schools, certainly on Brotherhood Week. Always I was there, and others were there too. There were some ministers and some black clergy who came as well to be on a panel along with various other political leaders. and to try to tell these kids that they've got to open their minds and their hearts. And so I did that. And I spoke to my congregation about it. And I also took part in the helping the AME Zion Church on Steamboat Road, which was a dilapidated old building and really very difficult for anybody to function in there as a minister or for the congregation itself. We helped them raise money in the town to rebuild the church. And it was, our temple was involved, other synagogues, a few other synagogues were in one way or another involved, and some churches were certainly involved, and the community cooperated and did raise the money, and we had a big celebration, a big dedication. So that was important, and our congregation was involved in that. Probably the most significant and difficult issue that came up, which I know you were thinking about, is the issue of the integration of the schools, the busing issue, which emerged. This was, I think, as well in the late 60s, if I recall correctly. And I was particularly interested in it because I had been working in Boston for 3 years, the kind of hiatus that I had taken from here, not knowing I was going to come back here, and became involved through my position in the Boston community with the civil rights movement. And there was an attempt to integrate the schools there, and they were severely prevented from doing so, largely by the school board, which was a real South Boston group, and by the superintendent of schools, a woman by the name of Louise Day Hicks, who would undoubtedly go down in history, will undoubtedly go down in history as one of the most bigoted, anti-black school officials in America at that time. And there were all kinds of marches. Martin Luther King came and spoke on the Boston Common. There were many gatherings that took place. I was myself among those who were arrested in the superintendent's office. And I remember once sitting there when the debate about busing of kids from South Boston was very hot in the newspapers, and it was being debated by the school board, who were very much opposed to it. And we went in there and into the meeting, and I was sitting next to an African-American kid, and at that point everybody was being referred to as black, or white, not so much as African-Americans. Anyway, he was sitting there, and one of the spokesmen against the busing, who was a member of the school board, said, "How can you possibly take a black child and put him next to who has not had much of an education and has very little cultural background, and put him next to a white child who's been raised in an environment in which there was learning and culture and definitely a different kind of world." And this kid sitting next to me yelled out, responding to, "How can you put them next to each other?" yelled out, "Get 2 chairs." And that sort of broke up the meeting, and then we all got arrested. So I brought that feeling down here. So when I heard this rumbling about busing, and the Committee on Human Rights, I'm quite sure, was very much involved in it. I got involved in it too, and I involved my then senior rabbi, because I was not yet the senior rabbi, Jacob Rudin, who had always been in favor of desegregation, and certainly a great liberal and visionary in his own way. He we were both part of it, and when the plans were made and the school chosen that we were going to bring kids from in Queens, and how it was going to be done, all carefully worked on with a great deal of sensitivity. I was very hopeful for it, but I knew there was a lot of opposition. In any event, we had a community service here at the temple, and it received a lot of publicity. And as a matter of fact, there was a television special on it entitled Guess Who's Coming to Great Neck? And it was right here in this very, very synagogue, chapel. And I remember Rabbi Rudin and I and other speakers were up there, and the place was jammed. And then it went to the community, and they voted it down. There was a lot of strong feeling, but there was no violence involved whatsoever. There was just anger, and a lot of people probably felt some degree of guilt, but they really felt that this would be a destructive event for their own child's education, and they felt it would change the nature of the community, and it just was something that wasn't happening, and they were very, very much opposed to it. So it didn't take place.
Were you very disappointed at the reaction?
Oh, well, I was disappointed that it didn't pass. I was hoping that more people would be won over to it. And it was probably very naive, and maybe it was too early, and maybe we shouldn't have done it. But then again, maybe we should have, because you can't win everything for sure. And in this case, the community made its feelings known. But we moved in other areas in that same consideration of how to bring the Black and the Jewish community together that were more successful. Well, as I said, the Great Neck community was a liberal community, and its Jewish population was largely of the more liberal persuasion of Judaism, Reform and conservative. There was certainly one Orthodox synagogue at that time, and then another one came along, and gradually the community, ultimately by the early 21st century, became much more traditional. A situation that was created by a movement of Orthodox Jews into it, and also by a real immigration of Persian Jews who were driven out of their homes, and they had a kind of different political philosophy because they were just in that generation not used to what we were trying to do here, to integrate, and all of that. But also because, to answer your question more directly, ethics is not something that is to be focused in the South or the North or the West or the East. I mean, ethics is a value. Understanding, compassion are values that are universal, and the Bible makes that very clear. As a matter of fact, and this was often quoted, he was often quoted by Martin Luther King, the prophet Amos, who said, "Let justice well up as the waters and righteousness as a mighty stream," one of King's favorite lines from the Bible, went from the South to the North to tell the people of the North that they had to change their ways and become more open and caring and honest in business and so on and so forth. And King would say that religion crosses boundary lines, and it can't be held to one sector or another. And so I think that the people here felt that, and as I've said, in Great Neck and in other parts of the North Shore, there were significant Jewish communities, even though, in a way, there were also Protestant communities that were, in the early 50s, very much opposed to Jews moving into Great Neck, very much opposed to it. And that's why a lot of Jews really moved out of Great Neck. Pardon me, a lot of Protestants moved out of Great Neck and other communities in the North Shore when there were more Jews that had moved in. So the Jews had this sense of, we were prejudiced against people, we were discriminated against. Our whole history has been on again, off again, certainly in Europe, one of persecution. So there was an identification with them. And the Jewish community became, all over the country, became part of the civil rights movement. And it was a movement that in many ways had leadership both from the black community and from the Jewish community. In fact, the NAACP, the National Conference, the National Council of NAA, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, pardon me for that, was, for a while, the president of it was a Jewish man by the name of Kivi Kaplan, who was helpful in founding the social action movement in Reform Judaism, and who established the Religious Action Center, a social action lobbying group in Washington, D.C. But the Jewish community, with the black community, really helped to change the landscape of social issues in America, and were down south marching and taking part in those kinds of issues all the time. He came as part of a panel of black leaders to discuss for the larger Great Neck community, the civil rights movement and what was going on and why they should be a part of it and why America needed it so badly. This was not that long before he was assassinated, but it was in the latter part of his, I guess, of his tenure as the voice for the civil rights movement in many ways. So there were very strong voices at that time too. So he came, and Whitney Young, who was the head of, I don't know whether he was the president of it, of the Urban League, which was a black pro-rights, pro-civil rights organization that was was quite moderate and was sort of aligned with the business community. And he was a little bit less apt to be accepting of making too much public noise. He certainly was a clear fighter for racial justice, but he was a little more to the right, I guess you would say. Now, I don't say it in a negative way, it was just the nature of the organization, whereas King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was more a younger group, and it was ready to march and ready to protest. And of course, King made certain that it was all very pacifistic and nonviolent. That was his message. I recall that the head of the Pullman Porters organization was invited to be there, and I don't know that he made it. And there was another black leader as well, and I've unfortunately forgotten his name and been unable to retrieve it from anything that I have found. But they came brought by Harry Wachtel, who was a member of the Great Neck community and a well-known attorney in Manhattan. and a strong liberal and pro-civil rights individual, and I think one of Martin Luther King's personal attorneys, and an attorney for the movement as part of what he did. It wasn't his only work at all, but he was very instrumental, and he brought them. He got them to come. He said, "My community needs this." So they came, and they came to our temple, and we had a big auditorium there. It's been shifted around now. It doesn't exist exactly the way that it did, but they were there, and they spoke on that particular evening. And it was an amazing thing. The speeches were all terrific and eloquent, and of course Martin Luther King was spellbinding in what he said, and the people who had come were very sympathetic with the movement. However, it's historic but little known that this speech was the first public utterance by King in opposition to the war in Vietnam. The black civil rights movement had stayed out of that because they were afraid they were going to antagonize the administration, the president of which, of course, was at that time Lyndon Johnson, who later on, we can remember him as a man who really brought about and made possible significant change, including the Voting Rights Act and all kinds of other stuff. But they were afraid to get into that. King had just felt, and he used the same kind of thinking in this regard as well, that you can't have justice in the world in the United States and see injustice perpetrated by our own country in another part of the world. So he said things of that sort, much more eloquently than I can. And Whitney Young became furious, and they got into an argument. And it was very interesting for the audience who'd never expected anything quite like that. They calmed down. They didn't take swings at each other, but they, who had been allies, began to really criticize each other in a very, restrained, dignified kind of way. And then it was over, and everybody went home. And I was, for some reason, I had something I had to do. It took a while. People talked. There was probably some refreshments, but the people drifted out, and then they were all gone. The building was practically empty, and I was alone in the office trying to finish up something before going home. And the phone rings, and I pick up the phone and I say, "Yes, Temple Beth-El." And I hear this deep voice saying, "It's Martin. Is Whitney there?" So I said, "No, Dr. King, I think he has gone." And he said, "Okay, goodbye." So that was my very personal conversation with Martin Luther King, whom I did have the opportunity of meeting and greeting in a sort of a way that evening. But he was trying to reach him, I guess, to patch up. But then, in a few weeks, I think it was a few weeks, he went to the Riverside Church. And this can be verified easily just by Googling Martin Luther King's Riverside Church speech, because it is characterized in the news items as one of his most important, if not most important, speech in that phase of his life. Because there, he very clearly attacked the war in Vietnam, and it was on the front page and the headlines of the New York Times and all over the country. And then the civil rights movement became involved in the anti-Vietnam movement, and ultimately, of course, the rest of the history of it, and it probably did make a significant change, or at least a big step toward the end of that bad, very, very problematic chapter in our history. So that was why he came and how he came and what he had to say. It was a very, very moving and very important moment. Well, Hazel, yes, I certainly worked with her, and she was involved. We were all kind of talking to each other, and we'd appear at programs and on panels together. It was not unusual, and they were very, very helpful. I don't want to fail to mention the minister of the Mount Olive Baptist Church, Reverend Edward Corley. Yes, he was very significant as far as I was concerned in what we were doing. It's a sort of a spin-off from Martin Luther King and the inspiration of King. It occurred to us in our temple to have a Martin Luther King Sabbath, Friday evening. We called it the Martin Luther King Shabbat. And then, of course, we began to have it on the weekend in which he is remembered. His birthday is remembered in, I guess, late January, early February, whatever. And we would invite the whole community, and including the churches, and the two African American churches would come. Not very many, and in fact, at the first Martin Luther King Sabbath that we had, there just weren't very many people there. I mean, people they weren't into this yet. This wasn't something that they really felt they had to be a part of. They in their hearts, they certainly were for the civil rights movement, as long as it, was a little bit somewhere else. There was a group that tried to bring it here and worked for many years on it, but the general population wasn't so about it. But Corley and I, Ed and I, each gave talks about the importance of having more brotherhood in the community. And I recall vividly, after the speeches, there were in the service, there were some comments, and we asked for comments. I remember one woman, a black woman sitting in the back, said, "This is really very interesting. Here you got all these people here, and we're together. We're talking about Martin Luther King. We're talking about understanding and brotherhood, and then we're going to go home and we're not going to see each other again. Maybe next year. Why don't you do something?" So Corley and I sat down after that and decided, okay, we got to have our congregations come together. And so we created a Black Jewish dialogue. And that worked. And we had a group of members of our congregation and a group of the black community from Mount Olive come together. First we started meeting alternately at the temple and then in their church. And ultimately, some of the meetings began to be in homes of our members. And we talked about, it wasn't something that I led or that Reverend Corley led. It was led by different lay people in our congregation. There were probably about 15 members of that dialogue from each of the two institutions. And a different person would be in charge of presenting a paper, what Jews believe about God, or what we think about Israel, or what the black community would talk about prejudice and some of the problems that they were experiencing in their lives. And the people became friends. And it went on for, I would say, a good 20-odd years. And it led to some big communal meetings, and and it was sponsored, and they were the sponsors later on of the Martin Luther King Shabbat, and they actually created the service and would decide, with the clergy's involvement here, how the service should be and who should be the guest speaker. So we had some remarkable speakers. We had our representatives in Congress. We had Senator Schumer, Hillary Clinton, when she was a senator, came, and of course that was very exciting. And we would have 1,000 people at this service, and it kind of helped to alert the community as a whole to the need for a growing sensitivity to the civil rights movement, and it's still going on long after I retired. So I'm very happy that at least that took place and continues to resonate. I think that it's a very good question to ask, and should be asked often, and especially to young people, because they're the ones who are going to have to do this. But we live in a country in which we really believe in equality, and we are a democracy, and a pluralistic democracy, and we have seen how we've become balkanized with various groups of ethnic or religious or racial character going off on their own and kind of being isolated. And we've seen extremists take advantage of this, and demagogues among them frightening people that too much integration with others will only lead to the dissolution of our own identities and to the things that we believe in. But the truth is that what America stands for, and what the world needs to see in America, is a sense not of a melting pot, but of a pluralistic ability to work together, respect each other, help each other, so that everyone has equal opportunity and equal chance to fulfill the liberties and freedoms which are really the truths that we believe in. And we see this challenged. When I was growing up, and it was when I was a young child, it was during the period of the Depression, we had very few resources, and my parents worked in various positions as a teacher, as a real estate salesperson, where there was a lot of contact with black people. And I came to know a lot of them. And while I didn't really go to school with them because they didn't live in the same neighborhoods in Kansas City at all, I did have the opportunity of realizing the need for reaching out to each other. It wasn't hard. I can't even think of it in any other way. I know there are people who really just cannot take that step, or at least in years back could not. But I think within the Jewish community, and I really believe this, the liberal Jewish community, there was always a sense of brotherhood. And my rabbi back in the 40s had all kinds of conferences and relationships in Kansas City with the black clergy. And I just learned that. It became part of me. I wouldn't even think of it in any other way. And I'm not saying this as some kind of heroic pioneer into race relations. It's just the nature, I think, for the most part, of Jews who really understand their faith, to realize that it's our battle too. Well, I think I would probably say that they do need to study the civil rights movement and to understand the battles that it faced and the accomplishments that it achieved. And then they have to study with leadership and people who are involved in the organizations that are fighting for fighting against prejudice and discrimination. They have to understand what the situation is now, the accomplishments that were made, but the challenges that remain, and even more significant, how the present climate is rolling back some of those accomplishments. For instance, the Voting Rights Act, which was so extremely important in enabling the minority communities, especially the black community, to have an opportunity to vote, is being rolled back by the states that take advantage of every opportunity to make it more difficult for minorities to register to vote, to be able to find the time to be able to vote. Various rulings of the Supreme Court have made the Voting Rights Act weaker, and the states that are run by leadership that is basically still quite bigoted against the black community have taken advantage of that. And you read about that and hear about that all the time. So it's a movement that needs to be revived. And the challenges that our present administration puts before us in all kinds of ways that are so unfortunately very destructive to the basic values of American life that we were taking for granted were becoming more and more real in their fulfillment, are now under a dark cloud of leadership. The experience at Charlottesville and the president's horrific reaction to it is a very clear sign of the work that has to be done. And his attitudes and the administration's attitudes toward Muslims and other minorities is such that one could say, as has been said, that the sewer of hatred, the lid has been taken off of it, and a great deal of hatred has crawled out of it and marched in the streets bearing the flags of nativism, of white supremacy. So in a way, we're back, way back. We're not really, I don't think, because I don't think the guts of the country are there. But until there's a strong leadership that's willing to really reverse this again and not afraid to do so, it's going to remain a dark challenge for the next generation. And I think that clergy and rabbis and political leaders have to speak out and shake up the political world today. The Republicans, I teach at the Hebrew Union College, and I teach students about social justice and what their involvement ought to be. And I tell them that never to speak about politics in a favoring one party over another. Today, I can't say that anymore. I think that unfortunately the Republican Party has blockaded much of these social ideals that need to be fulfilled, and we need courageous voices to challenge them. Well, yes, the song in South Pacific, you have to be carefully taught to hate and to fear all the people your relatives hate. I wish I could sing, but that song really says it all. And of course, little children don't grow up with any sense of prejudice against the an Asian person or a black person or a Hispanic person whatsoever. They don't even see it. They don't even see it. They identify kids of a different race by something else, the girl with the red dress rather than the girl with the black face. That's the way little children are. So of course you have to be taught. And that's why I think that in the South, where vigorous anti-black feeling was lived and experienced for decades and decades and decades, it's hard. It's hard for a certain generation to break from that. But one of the good things that's happened is that in America, there's been a lot of population movement. So you go down to Atlanta, which is right there in the middle of the South. It's a significant southern city, but it's much more cosmopolitan and intellectual and open than it ever was decades back. So I think that there's that kind of progress that's taking place.
Thank you for joining us for this program. And let us all remain committed to carrying on Dr. King's work and legacy by creating a more just society.